Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a quick look at the process for adding materials to our objects. A material is basically a node that we can connect to an object to give it different surface properties. We can use them to make an object look like it's made out of things like plastic or glass, or stone or wood, or skin, for example. It's quite a complex process, and in larger studios there are artists whose sole job it is to create materials and shading networks that are applied onto objects. So it can be a very complex process at more advanced levels. In this video we're going to take a look at two different methods that we can use for applying materials onto an object. So let's jump in and have a look at those processes. You can see here I've got a polygon sphere, and I've got my viewport mode set to smooth shade all just here, this little blue cube button, or you can use 5 on the keyboard to switch your viewport to that mode. So let's have a look at the first option for adding a material to an object. If we right click and hold on the object like this, we get our little pop-up menu appearing. And towards the bottom of the menu we have 3 options. We have assign new material, and the little full stops behind the word material indicate that this will open up a floating window or a panel. We have assign favorite material just here, and this gives us a short list of some basic Maya materials: Blinn, Lambert, Layered Shader, Fong-E, and so on. Now it won't matter that you don't understand what any of these are. These are basically arbitrary terms that have been assigned to these types of materials, in some cases by the software developers, and in some cases some of these names are actually the names of the software engineers or the mathematicians who actually invented these types of shaders to begin with. So that's basically what these are. Okay, don't worry if you don't understand what these words mean. We're going to take a quick look at a couple of these and just explain a couple of things about them. The third option is assign existing materials, and with this one, as we work on our models and we apply materials to them, this list of materials will actually increase with each new material that we add to the scene. So you can see here I've got a few new ones. I've got blue sphere, purple sphere, yellow sphere, and red sphere. These are materials that I've already created. The Lambert 1 material is the basic default material that Maya applies to any object that you build or that you create. So this is just the default grey material you already see on your objects. Now you shouldn't use this material or leave this material applied to your objects once you've kind of gotten to the point where you're adding textures to them. A lot of the settings for Lambert 1 are actually locked and you can't change them, and really this is just existing in the scene so you can see your objects while you're building them. Alright, so you should always try and replace that Lambert 1 material at some point. So what we're going to do is take a quick look at the assign new material panel. So I'll just select that. What we do is we get this little pop-up panel just here, and on the left hand side we have a few categories. Okay, we've got Maya, we've got surface, volumetric, and mental ray materials. On the right hand side we have a list of buttons, each with a little sample picture and a name of a material shader. So we have anisotropic, and this is used for doing brushed metal in particular. We have a Blinn. This is a shiny reflective type of material that we can use for doing things like rubber, plastic, metal, glass, that kind of thing. We've got a few more complex ones which are used more specifically. So I'm going to jump across a few of these down to the basic ones. We've got a Lambert, which is the same kind of material that's defaultly applied to your object, and so obviously you can kind of see what that looks like. A Lambert is basically a matte material, which is good for doing things like matte rubber, or matte skin on cartoon characters and so on. Anything that doesn't need shininess or reflection, you can use a Lambert for. We have a layered shader, and what this does is it basically allows us to combine multiple types of materials together and overlay them to create much more complex shader types. It sort of uses you can kind of imagine it as being a little bit like the layer system in Photoshop, where we can use blending modes and alpha channels to create an image in Photoshop. It sort of works on a little bit of a similar principle to that. We have an ocean shader here. You can apply that onto an object to make it look like it's made out of water. From memory, that is actually animated automatically. So it basically will give you kind of like when you render it, it'll kind of give you a rippling ocean effect. Just on the surface of the object, it won't actually make the surface of the object move like water. It just gives the surface the image of looking like water. A Fong and a Fong-E, so you can see here these also have a little kind of shiny highlight on them in a similar way to the Blinn. So once again, you can use those for anything that's shiny, like metal or plastic or glass. And then we have obviously we've got a lot more shaders. You can see them all the way down here. The only other ones generally that I use are the surface shaders, and this is at a basic level. I do use other ones that are more complex, but just for the basics. The other couple of basic shaders are the surface shader and the use background. The use background basically will display whatever color the background is, whether it's a photo loaded in the background or just a flat color. It will color the object in the same way. And a surface shader is basically a shader which ignores lighting and shadows, and it just gives you literally a matte color, almost like it's been kind of just filled with just a single color. So you won't get any highlights or shadows or anything working on that. That's actually a really flexible shader for more complex operations. So those are the basic shader types. Just as a little side note, some of these shaders or materials only work with certain rendering systems in the software. Anything that has an MI in front of it, generally, or an MIA or an MIB, are generally mental ray materials. And you can see that category here. Mental ray is a rendering system in Maya. There are several different rendering systems, and mental ray is one of them. Those materials will only work when you're using mental ray. So although you can apply them onto the object at any time, if you are not rendering your images of those objects using mental ray for your final exporting of your images, for example, the material won't show up. The object basically won't show up in your render because the rendering system you're using doesn't recognize these types of materials. So you just need to keep in mind that some of these work with certain renderers within the software. Some of them work with all of the renderers in the software. The basic shaders pretty much work with any renderer, whereas some of these are specifically used for certain rendering types. So the further down the list you go, the more likely it is that the materials won't work with the renderer that's set up by default, which is generally Maya software. But we'll cover some of that in a later video. So let's just select a Lambert material. Okay, so a Lambert's pretty much the same as what we already have on the object by default. Now when you add the material, the attribute editor panel should open up here on the right hand side. In older versions of the software, it will automatically jump to the material tab that you've just added to the object. In this case it's Lambert 3 for me. For most of you guys, if you've just opened a fresh scene and you have just an object, it'll probably say Lambert 2, but you can ignore the number. So yeah, in older versions it will jump to this tab. In this version, which is Maya 2013, I tend to find it opens the sphere shape, which means you've then got to manually go and look along the top here for the material you just added. Now, if you've already got multiple materials on your object, you will find that you'll probably have lots of tabs running right off the side here, and there'll be two little buttons with little triangle arrows on them. What you'll need to do is click on those arrows towards the right to scroll sort of your tabs along until you can find the material you just added. Now, it's not always going to be the one furthest to the right. Okay, sometimes it might be 2, 3, 4 tabs in from the right. So it's important to remember which material type you just added. Was it a blend? Was it a lambert? Was it a fong? And so on, so that you can find it. Now, as soon as you've turned this tab on, usually your best option, or the sensible thing to do, is to rename this. Now, the reason that we rename our materials when we apply them is that, as I mentioned just before, you might have lots of different materials stuck on this one object to make different parts of it look like different kinds of material. And if you haven't named them, you might find that there'll be several called lambert, and they'll have different numbers on. Now, the problem with that is that if you then are looking for that particular material to change some settings, you won't know which one is which from the list of the tabs along the top. So what you generally do is rename these something logical. So for example, if I'm going to change the color of this sphere to red, what I would do is call this red. So I'd type in red underscore shader, like this. Generally speaking, I put the name shader, or the word shader, in capitals. So if I press enter when I've typed that in, you can see the name of the tab changes to red shader. So now when I'm looking for this panel again from the list of tabs, I can find it really easily. There's my red shader. Okay, so down here we've got a sample, and this is just a thumbnail of what the material looks like at the moment. And at the moment you can see here it's just default grey. You can also see when you hover your cursor over it, it gives you this little thumbnail tooltip which says click to refresh the shader or the swatch image. Sometimes you'll make changes and this won't update. So what you can do is you can just click it or double click it, and it'll kind of just redraw this little sample and update it. Okay, so below that we've got a little type drop down menu here. If we needed to change this shader type or this material type from a lambert to something else, such as a blend for example, we can do it here on the fly without having to remove this material from the object and replace it with a new material we would have to make again. So we can change it just here straight away. So for example, if I hit blend, you can see here it changes it to blend 2, and the surface of the material has changed into this shiny, almost metallic looking material, indicated by this little thumbnail sample. Okay, now you'll notice that when I do that, it removes the name and renames it as the material type again. Now that's a bit of a pain when it does that, but you can just type in a new name again. Now I'm going to set this back to lambert. Okay, you can see here it goes back to lambert. In this case it's naming it lambert 4. So I'd have to rename this again. So I go red shader, like that. Press enter. Now you can see here it's automatically putting in underscores where I type the spaces in. Alright, that's pretty normal for Maya. Okay. So that's what the type drop down does. It basically just lets you change the type of material, and that's usually if you've accidentally applied a lambert and you wanted a blend, or you accidentally applied a blend and you wanted a fong, for example. You can just change it quickly there. Okay, so below that we've got settings that change the visual quality of this material. So for example, we've got color, so we can change the color of the object by using the slider. Now the slider is more of a brightness setting. So if you dial it down to the left, it'll be black. If you dial it right up to the end, it will be white. Now this is actually a little bit, that's a little bit incorrect, me saying it's a brightness. If we had a red color, for example, at the far right of the slider, this would be full red, and the middle would be dark red, and then this would be black. So it's not necessarily a brightness setting per se. It's not going to change every color from black to white. Okay. In order to add a color, we can click on the color swatch just here. Now, just as a quick note with this panel, if we move our cursor off the panel just here, it will disappear. So that's how we close that panel. We just move our cursor away. So I can click on here and I can select the color like that. You can use any of the color wheels. This is pretty stock standard for most graphic programs, so you'll find pretty much just similar settings in things like Photoshop and Illustrator and so on. So I'm not really going to cover sort of how to use this just here. Note, however, that this set of cross boxes just here, every time you select a color in any color picker in this software, it will automatically add that color to the left-hand end of this list, and it will kind of cycle all the other swatches you've used towards the right. Okay, so you can always get back to a color you've already chosen somewhere else, because it's usually always this one just here. Okay, so we've got transparency, so dialing that up will increase how much transparency is added to the object. So transparency is how see-through the object is. So you can use that to create things like glass or clear plastic. Ambient color basically makes the object appear like it's being lit from within, or that the surface of the object is sort of glow in the dark. Okay. Incandescence is similar but a little bit different. Basically, incandescence pumps up how much white is in the surface, but it also kills off the object's ability to receive shadows as well. So if there was a shadow on this object cast off something else, let's say this was under a tree, and there was like shadows of leaves on this, as we increase the incandescence value, the shadows would disappear, but the object also turns white. So you can kind of use ambient color and incandescence to kind of create, you know, fluoro effects and so on. It's good for doing light bulbs. Bump mapping, we can add pictures or other textures and link them into here using this little checker button at the end here. And we can make the surface of the material look like it's ripply or broken or cracked or whatever. It basically adds texture to the surface of the object. Diffuse is, you can kind of think of this more or less as sort of like a darkness brightness value. It's technically more a value of how much light is absorbed by the object, and this is based on sort of real world physics. Translucence is basically, this is sort of the effect that you get when you have, let's say, a lantern or a lamp inside a tent, and when you're standing outside the tent, you can see shadows of people inside the tent on the tent walls. That's what translucence is. It's also sort of similar to that sort of semi-see-through effect you get with candle wax and so on. So you can use this translucence value in conjunction with the depth and the focus to kind of get sort of waxy or sort of semi-opaque rubber, you know, or thin curtain type materials on your objects. Down here under special effects, we've got glow intensity, and what this does is it adds a glowing aura or a halo around your object or around the object with that particular material. So that's what that's for. Okay, so let's have a look at another quick method for adding a material. What I'm going to do is right click and hold on the object, and I'm going to select face mode, and I'm just going to select a few a few faces or polygons like that. And I'm going to right click and hold, and I'm going to come down to assign favorite material. So you can go back to new material, and that'll just pop that panel open, but I'm going to go assign favorite material, and I'm going to select the blend. Oops, like that. And you can see over here the attribute panel. You can just kind of go in, if this doesn't open up to blend, you can go in and look for the blend tab. I'm going to rename it, so I'm going to call this green. Oops. Make sure I spell green properly. Green blend shader, so I know which one it is. And you can see here it's got the same settings as before with the Lambert. The difference between the blend and the Lambert is that the blend has a reflection value, and it also has a specular value. A specular value, or a specular highlight, is this little shiny highlight we can see here on the sample. Okay, so that's called a specular highlight. These three settings, eccentricity, specular roll-off, and specular color, control what this highlight looks like. Eccentricity is the size of the highlight, so if we wanted something very gloss and slick, very glossy, we can reduce the highlight. So that would be something like a snooker ball or a billiard ball, or maybe some tiles, some very, very high gloss tiles. Or we can dial it right up like this and get sort of a more rubbery, velvety effect. Okay, so that's a really huge highlight. The specular roll-off is basically the brightness of the highlight. So all the way down to the left is completely off, so it looks more like a more like a lambert. And if we dial it all the way up, we get this really bright white little highlight here. The color just changes the color of this highlight. So, you know, if we wanted like a weird kind of pearlescent paint, for example, we could change this to something weird like a red. So we're kind of getting like a red highlight like that. And once again, don't forget you can change the color of it up here. So, you know, like if we went into like a kind of a weird turquoise color, we'd sort of get that that kind of effect like that. So that's what those settings do. Now, over here, you can see that we've applied this material to only those polygons. If I right click and hold and select object mode, you can see that those, sorry, I need to also click out here to deselect those polygons. You can see here now when I rotate this around, I can kind of see that little weird red highlight in there on that part of the material. So I've got two different materials applied onto the one object using different polygons. Okay, so I'll just select the object again. The other settings that I just wanted to point out very quickly there, you can see here now we've got the object selected. I've got the red shader here and the green blend shader up here. So I can select either of those and change settings in them. So back on this blend shader just very quickly, I've also got a reflectivity value and a reflected color. This is basically how much reflection this object has. So when I dial it all the way to the left, basically I have zero reflection. So it's sort of similar in that regard to the Lambert shader, this red material. And if I dial it all the way up to the right hand side, I get a reflectivity value of 1, which is almost like a mirror reflection. It's like maximum reflection. So those are a couple of ways that you can apply materials to objects in Maya. There are one or two other methods that you can use, including creating materials in the Hypershade panel. And I'll look at the Hypershade panel in another video because it's a little bit more complicated, and it'll take an entire video to kind of go through the basics of that. But as you can see, there are different types of materials. Ones that have different properties such as shininess, specularity, reflection, and so on. And you use different types of materials on your objects to make them look like different types of materials that you'd find in the real world, like metal or plastic and so on. So I'll leave this video here, and in other videos we'll take a little bit more of a look at how to apply materials, and also we'll look at editing materials and using other types of material nodes in conjunction with one another. So I'll see you then.